The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Good afternoon. Make sure my mic is high enough here. It's great to have all of you here. My name is Jon Sawyer. I'm the director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporitng, a nonprofit journalism center based in Washington. And the University of Chicago is one of our campus consortium partners. And it's great for us to be on campus and to bring our journalism initiatives here. 18 months ago, we began an initiative on religion and public policy issues around the world. We did so with support from the Henry Luce Foundation and with an unusual mandate: to draw on our network of university partners to build reporting initiatives and educational outreach programs that would go deeper than conventional journalism, and we hoped encourage broad public debate. Over the past year, this initiative has produced reporting on the rise of Pentecostalism in conjunction with the University of Southern California, and on the role of religion and attitudes toward reproductive health in conjunction with Washington University in St. Louis. You can find these and other of our religion reporting projects on our website, pulitzercenter.org, under the gateways that are featured on our homepage, and I hope you'll take a look. At this point, we have about 35 different projects from all over the world on a broad range of religion issues. We also began working on the initiative that we're discussing today, on the unusual role religion is playing in China's response to multiple environmental challenges. Unusual in that for decades, religions and traditional culture were officially repressed in China, and now you have senior government officials openly invoking religions as part of the, quote, ecological civilization China needs to meet its challenges, and you have prominent journalists and academics just as open in declaring their adherence to faith systems once considered taboo. This past weekend, we aired the first of our reports on this subject for the PBS program Religion and Ethics News Weekly. It's a short clip, about 6 minutes. We'll show it now as a way to frame the discussion that follows, first with the filmmaker and journalist who have worked with the Pulitzer Center on this and other environmental projects, and then a second panel with academic and journalist specialists on the role of religion in China and on the country's response to its environmental challenges. So with that, we'll start the video. We're covering a lot of ground tonight, so we'll move quickly through these panels, and I hope we can be disciplined enough in giving you a feel for all these issues to leave lots of time for questions and answers. So with that, I think the video can roll. I have to signal the top. We'll see. Thank you all.
On the 20th floor of a Beijing high-rise, one of China's senior environmental reporters is becoming a Buddhist. Liu Zhencheng is an investigative journalist. His first story about the environment was an exposé about illegal dam construction on the upper Yangtze River. It made national headlines. His hard-hitting stories eventually got him fired, so he continued his work at China Dialogue, an international online journal. After 10 years of reporting, he says, he was feeling burned out.
Every day, what we do are good deeds, which may give us positive energy. But meanwhile, what we are facing is the darkest side of the world. As an environmentalist, every day what we see is polluted air, polluted rivers, and the slaughter of wild animals. This kind of negative energy attacks us every day. Where do we draw our strength from?
Liu Zhencheng is one of millions of Chinese who are returning to Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian temples that were once condemned by the government.
A little more than 4 decades ago, during China's Cultural Revolution, many Buddhist temples like this one in central Beijing were destroyed or defaced. Today, these temples are alive with worshippers. By some accounts, 1 out of every 5 Chinese call themselves Buddhist.
Some scholars say this search for faith is linked to China's massive environmental problems.
In a world in which capitalism and socialism and and consumerism have created a kind of industrial behemoth that is just thundering ahead, that is draining life out of the villages, that is polluting the soil and the air and the water. You have a heartless world. But you mentioned that I've translated both Lao Tzu and Zhuang Tzu.
Martin Palmer, shown in a Chinese TV broadcast here, is based in the UK but has been working in China for nearly 20 years, urging religious groups to respond to this crisis and to encourage conservation. In 2006, he realized this message was also being heard by the Communist Party.
I was called in for a meeting in 2006 with the Minister for the Environment, Minister for Religion, and they were very frank. They said the single-child policy has created the most selfish generation in China's history because each child has been brought up as the center of absolute devotion by the family. Nothing is too much to give to them. And these two Communist Party officials said, we want the religions to help us bring compassion back.
But what is it that finally persuades an individual like Liu Jiancheng to cross the gap from atheism to Buddhism, in his case the smaller Tibetan branch, which has about 5 million adherents? Shirley Hong is a journalist and filmmaker. She's known Liu for more than 10 years, but she was still surprised by his decision.
When I learned that Jianqiang was converted, I was really shocked. You know, our generation, like we have been raised as atheists through childhood. We were taught that, you know, all religious beliefs are, you know, superstitious. So it's very hard for me to believe in any religion. I feel there's a huge gap. I was very curious, you know, I want to know what has made him to cross that gap. So I, you know, start to think my other friends who was converted to Buddhism.
To satisfy her curiosity, she took a film crew to the highlands of western China, an area adjoining the autonomous region more commonly known outside China as Tibet. It's rich in biodiversity that conservation groups say is greatly imperiled. This is also home to the headwaters of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, quite literally a lifeline to hundreds of millions of people downstream. A prominent person in her documentary is a monk named Tashi Sange. He explains how conservation and respect for all living things has long been an intrinsic part of life here.
My grandmother taught me that I shouldn't wash my hands or pee in the river or make it dirty. I said, why? They told me there is a dragon god. I asked them what the dragon god looks like, and they said, don't say it, don't say it. Mama and Papa told me in secret that this is a sacred lake, but they said, don't ever talk about it openly because we couldn't talk about gods. They do not exist in the Communist Party's eyes. They are superstitions. If anyone talked about a god, they would be beaten, so we wouldn't dare to say it.
But through thick and thin in a country that's seen so much political upheaval and social change, those fundamental values have endured, he says.
Who will protect the environment? In the West and in China, it's the government's responsibility. But the Tibetans don't think this way. This is not the Buddhist way. If you think that way, you are not a Buddhist. You are the protector. No matter if you are a newborn or an 80-year-old, you are all protectors. You are all responsible, and you have the responsibility. All life should be protected.
Back in China's capital, Liu Jiancheng, guided by the Tibetan monk Chamei Rinpoche, says his spiritual journey has changed the way he sees the world and his whole approach to writing.
Before, I only wrote from a legal point of view. It's wrong, this is a national park, and how can you destroy it? Now when I write, in my mind, what I think is they are fishes. They are millions of lives. When I write this way, I think that I should speak on their behalf. I shouldn't just think of what is good for us, what's good for humans. I can clearly see the change in me.
China's omnipresent and officially atheist Communist Party appears to be actively supporting traditional culture, as one official called it, at this recent gathering. The former Communist Party Central Committee member said ecologically sustainable civilization begins with simple concepts.
What we think in our hearts and minds will determine the state of the environment. Traditional Chinese culture promotes harmony between man and nature and encourages limited consumption and a simple way of life. We support this. We don't oppose taking from nature. We do oppose overexploitation. We want Gold Mountain, but we also want Clearwater and Green Mountain.
My sense is that this partnership between religion and the government around environment is only going to get stronger and stronger.
A partnership that he hopes will help lower the heavy environmental price China is paying for its economic progress of recent decades. For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, this is Fred de Sam Lazaro.
So this video is taken from a longer 20-minute documentary, Searching for Sacred Mountain, that was co-directed by Canadian filmmaker Gary Marcuse, who is with us from Vancouver, sitting on the far left. Also with us is Liu Zhang, the Beijing editor of China Dialogue and the principal subject of the film, a principal subject of the film. The three of us met in Guangzhou a year ago, and it was out of our discussions then that this project arose, as well as the three-part series on soil pollution that Zhang edited for China Dialogue and for Yale Environment 360 that came out earlier this summer. So Gary, let's start with you. I mean, your own past work on environment and religion issues in China and the unusual collaborations that led to Sacred Mountain.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Just a quick little quiz here. How many people are reasonably certain that China has environmental problems? And how many people were aware that China has an environmental movement? Okay, it's the word's getting out there, but you are a specialized audience. It's certainly when I started this film 2007 and 8, when we were doing the research, nobody had heard of it. But when I went to China, I rather quickly came in contact with Xu Lihong, Liu Zhang, Ma Jun, and a whole series of mostly journalists who were the leaders of the new environmental movement. I was actually on my way down to Yunnan province to do some filming with a community organizer down there who works with the Nasi people, who have a religion quite similar to Tibetan Buddhism. And I thought it would be really interesting to contrast urban Beijing with, say, these Nasi communities to see whether there was a different ethic about the environment in what I took to be basically it's a farming society, but in a traditional way, much closer to hunter-gatherers, which had been the subject of earlier work that I did. And I had been sort of dividing in my mind the two roles of agriculturalists versus hunter-gatherers, and trying to explore the differences, which I had done in Russia for another film. On my way down, though, Liu Zhang and others told me that really they diverted me onto a much more productive story, which was about a new campaign to stop a huge dam at Tiger Leaping Gorge. And that became the core of the film that we did. We finished that film in 2011. It's been circulating ever since. But when I came across Jon Sawyer then in Guangzhou, something had changed, which was that he was now a Tibetan Buddhist. And Xu Lihong said that her husband was bugging her, like, why wasn't she also a Tibetan Buddhist? And so I said, well, let's collaborate, because I can't go to the Tibetan areas to shoot. I will be way too conspicuous. But you can go up there with a crew. We'll edit it into Vancouver. So we managed to use the kind of the inside stories to eke out a very kind of basic essay, I think, on why it was that Jon Sawyer became a Buddhist. If you're interested, on the website, I guess when we finish this, we'll put up the 20-minute version. And if you liked Tashi Sangye, there's quite a lot more of him in that. So you'll be able to really get a much deeper feeling for that than was allowed on PBS broadcast, who worked diligently with us to make at least this much available. 6-7 minutes, that's huge these days on television, so we're very grateful.
Well, I think one other thing you might point to, Gary, is that the piece that's also not in the short version, but is in the longer version from Lu Shi, the biologist from Peking University.
I've discovered that among your friends and Shula Hong's friends, tremendous number of people were converting to Tibetan Buddhism. It wasn't just an isolated process. I couldn't say it's widespread because I don't have the numbers. But I also discovered that there were a number of Han Chinese who were working closely with the Tibetan Buddhists, who were just fascinated by the way in which they created and maintained sacred mountains. And there's a conservation biologist named Lu Chu from Peking University that you'll be interested to see in the longer film. But she and her students documented, did a study which is available online that demonstrated there's greater biodiversity in these areas that have been protected, that most of the protected areas are still intact, and that in one region alone there were 1,500 sacred mountains, which added up to protected areas about the size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined in a district that's only as big as New York State. So you could see there it's kind of striking potential for the communist government to perhaps relax some of its suspicion of the Tibetan Buddhists and embrace the fact that they have already made a set of nature reserves that complement the ones that they're already establishing up on the high plateau. So it's a kind of amazing cross-section of Han Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, and conservation techniques that I think could be certainly the subject of a longer documentary.
So just one final point on the journalism part of this. Gary, you might walk through, this is what you just saw was kind of a documentary within a documentary within a documentary and the various, how that worked. You're sitting in Vancouver and trying to edit this.
Yeah, I've worked a lot with Shula Hong. She donated 100 hours of her footage to the previous documentary I made because she had been following the organizing of a valley that rose up against a big dam and succeeded in stopping it. So we had this great working relationship and kind of understood each other. And so I wrote tons of notes in Vancouver and sent them off to her, and in typical fashion she would respond to about 1 in 5 emails. But everything I gave her was going into the maw, and she then found a very good cinematographer and headed up into the hills and shot all the stuff she thought was needed, and lots of things that I did as well. And so in the longer form you'll see that it's just sort of it's her story of going up into the mountains, and then within that is a little story by Tashi Sangye about his trying to save Tibetan vultures. So there's a lovely portrait of Tibetan vultures that you'll get to see. It's a gem. So
and then we had Fred de Sam Lazaro, who's done a number of projects with us, who's a correspondent for PBS NewsHour. So we had him for maybe 2 days, I think, in Beijing.
4 hours.
But it was enough that we could make him sort of the face and the narrator of the story. And we're hoping that this piece, a version of it, will run on NewsHour as well. And so it's very important to have Fred and his team, even though we were very efficient in using his time, I think.
And I guess my closing comments, because such an interesting number of people here involved in environmental studies, is we'll post information on their website directing you to the kind of research that's done by Lu Chu, because she's really trying to spread the word about what the Tibetans are doing. She's even formed a foundation together with lamas called Shan Shui. So there's some amazing work going on there, but it could really, I think, use your help to circulate this information to interested people in North America.
Good. So, Lu Jinjiang, you are one of China's leading environmental reporters, and I think more accustomed to asking questions than to being the subject of a documentary. So I'm curious as to your own journey and your reflections about being a public face of China's turn to religion, at least within some circles.
I think maybe, friends, you may be wondering how did I convert as a Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist, not Chinese Buddhist. It sounds strange, but I think I believe the karma. That's the karma. I must have some connection with Tibetan Buddhists. And when I finished my reporting on Tiger Leaping Gorge, Gary just mentioned that the reporting was very powerful. So the former Premier Wen Jiabao read the article and postponed the project. And Professor Lu Zhi you mentioned, from Beijing University noticed me because I interviewed her, and she found I'm a pretty good journalist. So she called me, come on to Tibet, we are going to have a journey. So in 2005, it was my first journey to Tibet. Actually, there was, Li Zhi helped a local ecology festival, something like that, local people change their traditional some traditional festival to an ecology festival. I was surprised to realize that the Tibetan people are they're very happy, even they are not wealthy. So I started to think about why. Why? Because most of Chinese people have only one religion. Before Chairman Mao died, passed away, we believe in Chairman Mao is the only God. But after that, the Chinese religion, the belief is money. So many people are very depressed, even they are much healthier, much wealthier. So I started to think about, and I interviewed many Tibetans and published articles about that on my newspaper, Southern Weekly, Nanfang Zhoumo. And then I think maybe I should write a book about Tibet history, relationship with Han Chinese, and their environmentalists. So, and I went to Tibet many times, and then I was fired by my boss on newspaper, so I got a lot of time to go to Tibet. And then I finished my book, which was very popular in China, but 6 months later, it was banned in mainland China. Then I came to, I have 2 minutes, okay. Then I came to UC Berkeley to be a visiting scholar, and spent 2 years there and finished my book. I spent 2 years there and finished my book in Hong Kong after the book was banned in mainland China. Then I work for China Dialogue, and then China Dialogue was blocked by China government. So I'm a really troublemaker. So, but why I, was converted as the Buddhist? Because, especially when I met Gary in 2010, to be a journalist and environmentalist in China, I will face dark side of the China every day. Even we had a lot of success, but you will see every day the environment getting worse. So it made you, hopeless. And one day, some friends of my Tibetan friends were put in jail, and I can do nothing for them. So I was very depressed. I need some support, spiritual support. So I studied traditional culture of China and Daoism, Confucianism. But finally, I found I can get something from Tibetan Buddhism, which can support me to continue my journey on environment and journalism. That's my story.
So just one quick follow to that. I mean, what do you think is going to be the response? Will it be possible for us to show this film, the longer version of this, in China? Will people be receptive to it? Will the government be allowed? Will it have any effect on your work to have this story told?
Actually, I don't know. To be honest, that when you and Gary talked to me, I was, I concerned a little bit, because in China there are many sensitive things like religion, like freedom of press, like military and foreign policy, something. Religion is very personal. Actually, you can see China government, it seems that they support the traditional culture, but is because I think the Communist Party is concerned of losing their authority. If everybody have their own God, not Chairman Mao or Communist Party, so it will be risky for them. So it's not easy for them, but it's okay for me. But I don't believe many people hope to let public know their religion.
Well, I think our hope was to frame this in a way that it could, be, people would be open to talking about. We'll see. That's what we're going to be trying to do. So this is this Sacred Mountain is one of over a dozen projects that we've supported on environmental and other issues in China. Another is the extraordinary work by Sim Chi-yen, a Beijing-based photographer who is a member of the Seven Photo Agency, on the fearsome toll of silicosis on one Chinese mining family. And we've asked Chi-yen, who's just come in from Beijing, to share her experience in telling that story.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm not, as a foreign correspondent based in...
Chi-yen, I think I may be supposed to signal now that we're going to do that. We're going to have your slides, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
It worked. Good.
So I'm not focused on environmental issues. I'm more focused on sort of social, political issues. But as a foreign correspondent and photographer based in China, you can't really escape from reporting on environmental issues. So we're just going to show some slides as I speak. These are some work, some test sheets from the New York Times and other publications that I've worked for on environmental issues. So obviously, I've shot on soil pollution, on lead poisoning, and dam building, and air pollution for a range of American and European publications. One of the stories that you'll see here is a long project that I did with Ian Johnson, who's going to be speaking on the second panel. It's on air pollution in an industrial city called Handan, or town, actually. It's in Hebei province. It's less than 3 hours by fast train from Beijing. And it's very near a lot of coal-related industries. So we kind of went in search of the pollution, and I tried to visualize that pollution, which is not always that easy. So in this part of, I think all that Gary and Jianqiang have said are true. I think in the big cities, certainly there is there's a growing environmental movement, and it dovetails really nicely with this religious resurgence, which you're going to hear more of in the second panel. But I think in smaller places like Handan, for instance, Ian and I spent a lot of time drinking a lot of beer with the locals before we could even get people to be honest and frank about the fact that there was an air pollution problem. So we destroyed our livers on those trips, really. And you would see in some of the pictures that people are enjoying the nightlife, even when it's 300 on the air pollution index out. And they're not wearing masks. And if they're wearing masks, they're wearing sort of chiffon, lacy masks, more as sun protection than as air pollution protection. So I think in the big cities, for sure, in Beijing now, masks are a dime a dozen. Regular Chinese friends of mine will buy online the best masks they can afford, and they'll wear it with no shame, even if they're just walking down the street. But in smaller places like Handan, there's still only the beginnings of a recognition of an air pollution or greater environmental problem. Also, I think, but of course, there are Chinese friends of mine who, because of interaction with the West or education in the West, they have come to realize that they have to look deeper in themselves to find some kind of spiritual compass, moral compass. And there's a guy that I know who's a Chinese filmmaker who has become vegetarian because of the environmental impact of the meat industry and all the rest of it. So there are clear examples like that. By the same token, I think that there is suddenly a lot of interest in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism amongst Han Chinese. On one story that I shot for Time magazine, I met a bunch of them. And it seemed to me that their understanding of Buddhism may not necessarily be that deep yet. So they were doing a lot of things like fang sheng, which is like letting go of fish or tortoises into nature. But they didn't really think about the environmental impact of that. That could change the ecology of that lake or that river that they were letting those animals into. But I think in any country, quite often the people at the forefront of civil society are somehow religious. I think in China, sometimes it's harder to discover that they're indeed religious. But if we went and dug in the bios, or if we befriended those people, I think we realized that a lot of the human rights lawyers in China are very quietly Protestant. And it's not an unusual trajectory. I come from Singapore originally. A lot of the people at the forefront of civil society there are Catholics or Buddhists or Muslims. And in fact, another parallel is that in a closed society like Singapore, which is not dissimilar to China, it's the green movement that kind of was at the forefront of civil society. Thank you.
So we didn't talk that much about the silicosis project, but these last pictures are coming from that project, and there's more of that on our site. And this is a project that's coming, and it is an incredibly powerful project about this family. So I encourage you to look at that. So we're going to have a second panel, but first we'd like to have questions for this panel. So let me take questions. I have questions, but we'll see what you have from the audience in the front.
I just have some short informational questions. You said it was a website? Oh, sorry. You said there was a website? Are you talking about the CIS website or the?
I was talking about the Pulitzer Center website.
The Pulitzer Center website.
PulitzerCenter.org, okay. And all of these projects are there. And
we have competing organizations
all right.
here.
Well, I'm sure that's a good organization. You should refer to that as well.
Okay. Excellent. And then what was the exact name of the gorge that the dam was opposed in?
Tiger Leaping Gorge.
Tiger? Tiger Leaping Gorge. Excellent. Thank you.
If you look up the film Waking the Green Tiger.
Which was Gary's film, his earlier film with Xi Leong. Question back here?
I'm kind of curious about how the Chinese media is covering the problems, the environmental problems, if they are covering the environmental problems. Are people able to read about this in the Chinese media and see this on TV?
Do you want to? We'll talk more about that, but Jean, you want to talk? You want to address that? I mean, yes, the short answer is there is coverage. There's a surprising amount of coverage, and as we found, and when we were looking to do projects on the environment in China, one reason we ended up working with China Dialogue and Xinjiang was because there was so much great reporting coming from Chinese journalists, and some of the best reporting, and this was an area. Everything is you cannot generalize anything about China, but it is, my impression is that there has been, at the regional level, there's been opportunities to do very strong reporting. I mean, your work is an excellent example over the last 10 years.
Yeah. I think actually it's become easier to report on the environment in China in recent years. I think over time it has become less sensitive because it's become part of the mainstream government agenda to some extent. Of course, it still depends from place to place. And quite often you have local factory owners going after you rather than the government. But I think, generally speaking, it has become less sensitive.
Certainly when we were making Waking the Green Tiger, we had a very senior official named Chu Guoping, who was the head of the state agency for the environment, and he gave a very candid and extensive interview which outlined a lot of the problems and his attempts to create a Ministry of the Environment that was transparent and featured accountability from the bottom up. So he said at the end of our interviews, he said, this is kind of like a nice model for the evolution of democracy in China. So they kind of see the connection there between public participation and the solutions to some of the issues on the environment.
And you had, in there instances like the air pollution data that was almost a state secret a few years ago, and then suddenly the government started not only releasing it, but pointing it out at conference, say this will not stand. And so you had these officials saying we're going, and this is where you began to have these conversations about ecological civilization, and China has got horrendous problems, but we're going to solve it the Chinese way with the traditions of Confucianism or Buddhism or whatever. And so that's how that conversation came into play.
But can we follow up by asking about why China Dialogue, is banned? And Sim, I'd love to draw you out, your project that was. But so what about China Dialogue and what's going to happen there? And maybe you can tell the audience why this is so important.
The questions about China Dialogue, that the organization based in London that Xinjiang works for, is Beijing editor for, and has been banned in China.
My colleague, actually the founder.
You got it.
Thank you.
Once is enough.
The Isabel Hilton is a very famous journalist, from a British journalist, and she was one of the first Western students to go to China during the Cultural Revolution. So she knows China very much, and about 10 years ago, climate change has been becoming a very big issue. But if you, the world want to deal with climate change, you have to talk to China. So China will be the #1 carbon emission. So the idea was talk to China with Chinese and the English. We are bilingual website. So that was the idea. But we met in Berkeley about 8 years ago. She talked to me, and then we talked in Beijing. So some leading environmentalists, including the Wang Yunchen, Ma Jun, told her that in China, climate change is a big issue, but pollution, water pollution, air pollution, food safety is more important for the Chinese people. So when we launched the London office and the Beijing office, we focused on all the environment issue. So right now, China Dialogue address all climate change, energy, pollution, soil pollution, and policy. So, we are very small, but it's very unique because it's bilingual and focus on China and the environment. So many media look at the China Dialogue as a news resources. Yeah.
Is it still blocked though?
Very good question, yes.
I'm sorry, the question again is?
Is it still blocked?
Yeah.
You're saying it's better reporting, but the fact that China Dialogue has been blocked.
Right. It's been blocked, yes.
Yeah, it was blocked. So, it's very complicated. That China's censorship system. Why it was blocked? Because 1.5 years ago, there was a mining disaster in Lhasa, very close to Lhasa. So the more than almost 200 workers were killed by the disaster. And I found that actually 2 years earlier, we have already reported the risk. We told the government, it's very risky. You have to make sure that because the local people didn't like, they demonstrate against the project. But the company, the mining company usually is a very huge company with connection with high officials. But they ignored the warning. Then almost 200 people were killed. So we reported this issue, the story. We were the only media to report the issue. Then the next day, we found we were blocked. So it's very interesting. It doesn't mean that China, the government, cares about China Dialogue very much, like New York Times or Bloomberg, just because they found some news about Tibet. Because Tibet is a very sensitive topic in China. There are 3 topics sensitive in China. One is Tibet and Xinjiang. Another one is about the Chinese leaders' families' corruption. And the third one is about, I forgot. Yeah. So
Democracy.
Not democracy. So we were blocked, and we found we post all our contents, articles on other Chinese website, huge website, and it's okay.
Right.
So that means the Chinese reader can read China Dialogue's article anywhere. So it's okay. And with China Dialogue's logo. So.
Other questions in middle?
Sorry, my hearing's not good. Did you catch that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite got that either. So you,
yeah.
How Buddhism can be helpful in facing the problems concerning the environment. But what about the rest of China? Can religion be of any use in helping facing the environmental crisis?
Are you thinking specifically of Tibetan Buddhism?
no, you're saying beyond Buddhism. Are you saying that other, is there a
Beyond
role
Buddhism,
for
beyond
other?
Tibet.
Right, right. Right. I think that we will address it. The next panel, I think, will address that question more.
Thank you.
So, but it's a very good question. One more back there, and then we'll switch the panels. We're going to pass it. There's a over to the side.
Hi, thank you. Ms. Sim mentioned that it's becoming easier to cover the environment in mainstream news in China, but we also talked about how Chinese environmental movement is still very young. And if this environmental movement develops a religious conscience, won't it make it even harder for it to spread its message beyond like the clutches of the Communist Party and strain its relationship with the government even further? It's addressed to anybody.
Well, I can take a stab at that. Well, I think most people who are activists in China don't wear religion on their sleeve. So I think you can separate out the two. I mean, I don't think the people in the Green Movement go out as bra-burning Christians or Buddhists, really. So I don't really see that that is an issue right now. And I don't think any savvy operator working in activism in China would necessarily want to touch religion.
Yeah, but I think that what's interesting, maybe what you're getting at, is that I think there is a tendency, historically, we all know, that as people become engaged in religion and faith, after a while, most of them do want to wear it on their sleeves. And so they may not, savvy, they may at the beginning, they'd be very careful how they operate, what they're doing. But as it becomes central and sort of core to their identity, then they begin to speak out about it. So that's at some point that I think is a potential, a possibility in China, and will have interesting ramifications.
Just a quick comment on that. Dr. Lu Chu, when we interviewed her towards the end of her discussion with us about the science of this, she said, first of all, Buddhism is very comforting to conservation biologists because their notion of conservation is very much like our notion of ecology. And then she ended by saying, she finds it much easier to talk about conservation with people who have a religion. So she's hoping that really grows in China. And that kind of struck me because I'm not sure that's true in North America. It's a different kind of situation, different kind of setup. I don't see religions as such taking a leading role. So it's kind of I think it's going to take a little bit of cultural observation to figure out how it works there.
Well, with that, why don't we do a quick switch of the seats and the microphones, and the panel will have the second panel, and we'll hear from them. Thank you all. So I think here we'll begin with Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn is a specialist on Asian religions and co-director of Yale University's Forum on Religion and Ecology, a joint master's degree program at the Schools of Divinity and Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale. Mary Evelyn has been hugely helpful to me, educating me on this topic, including getting me to the conference last fall in Henan Province that marked the launch of the International Confucian Ecological Alliance. So Mary Evelyn, if you can begin.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, fellow panelists and those who preceded, and the work that you're all doing. So the assumption here in this Forum on Religion and Ecology that we started in 1998 after a series of conferences at Harvard on the world's religions, Asian and Western and indigenous, was to examine values regarding nature, environmental ethics, and so on, that would be culturally differentiated throughout the world. And my area of study is East Asia, and those of us studying East Asia in graduate school and elsewhere were deeply concerned about what was going to happen in China and Japan, and, well, not Japan because it's already developed, but China and India as it developed, as these two countries, each of 1 billion people, had rapid modernization. All of that was on the horizon. What was this going to mean for the global community? And what kind of values would contribute to an environmental ethics that wouldn't be based on Western religions or even Western philosophy and so on. So that was the inspiration for these conferences, and we brought together both scholars and environmentalists, activists, scientists from Harvard. These were at the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religion, and the conferences were over about 3 years. And the first two were actually on Confucianism and Buddhism. And out of these came a series of 10 volumes on these different world religions, the Confucianism and ecology, and Buddhism and ecology, Daoism and ecology, and so on, to suggest that there are other world views that have very significant views of nature, and so on. It was also to say, at that time and up until the present, that religion, broadly conceived, is not necessarily an answer to our environmental problems, but along with science, along with legislation, along with economics and policy and so on, values, ethics, a spiritual perspective was absolutely essential. And in fact, at Yale, the former dean there, Gus Speth, a very distinguished environmentalist, founded NRDC and World Resources Institute and UNDP development program, brought my husband and I to Yale because he said after 40 years of doing environmental work, legislation isn't working, and we've got the scientific facts. We know a great deal about these problems, but the value changes are essential. So that's a recognition that is actually taking place rather widely now, or more widely than 25 years ago when we started this project. So even the big organizations in Washington, environmental organizations, TNC and Sierra Club and so on, are interested in this kind of work. But what I want to say is certainly religions have their problems, they have their promise. And religions historically have not lived up to what they have aspired to, their teachings and so on, we know that well. As well, environmental history, which is actually quite robust at Yale, is showing that even great ideas on the environment doesn't necessarily mean that China in its pre-modern period took care of its forests and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, if we jump right into the present over very complex ideas and historical circumstances and so on, if we say what is happening in China, to the extent that we can understand it, because it's extremely complex, as was noted already, there is a renewal of religions since a Freedom Act came forward in the late 80s for religious freedom and so on. So there's a fascinating resurgence of Buddhism, of Confucianism, and Daoism. The sacred mountains, pilgrimages, and so on, the Taoist temples reviving, and Confucianism, which is my own special area of study in particular, is quite interesting. So let me just say very quickly, so our other panelists can make their comments as well. Within the umbrella of what was mentioned of ecological civilization or ecological culture, which is actually government policy in the Constitution as of November 2012, that the Chinese Party and central government realized they are up against the limits of this heavily polluted country. So culture matters in their thinking. That is a fascinating thing, absolutely fascinating, because this is one of the oldest civilizations in the world where culture has been significant over time. So the revival of some of these traditions is not just an abstraction. It's part of government. The conference that we were at together, the governor of Hunan province came. That's a province of 93 million people. It'd be the 12th largest economy in the world. The governor stayed for a good part of that conference on ecological civilization, focused largely on Confucianism and ecology and that revival of that tradition. His ministers were there. His minister of finance got up the last day and said, we need a circular economy that's non-waste type of economy. So, just to conclude, the Confucian revival, with all of its problems and sometimes its distortions for ideology or government purposes, has a government level, a political level. It has a very interesting academic level of conferences that have been going on for the last dozen years on Confucianism and its modern import, and also a popular level in relation to this spiritual vacuum that is in a highly materialist culture. And this book on Confucius sold 10 million copies by a popular media journalist, professor in Beijing. But I think the ideas of these traditions are robust, are continuous into the present despite discontinuity, and we can certainly talk about that. But what I think is so fascinating is in teaching these traditions for more than 35 years, our students here in the West are also very fascinated with what does it mean to have a sense of heaven, earth, and human as one continuous dynamic cosmology in which humans complete that sense of nature and make a contribution to a common future. So these traditions are not just, I think, for the Chinese and their resurgence, but for a new world culture as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. So next we have Dali Yang, a professor of political science and founding faculty director of the University of Chicago Center in Beijing. As your bio sheet notes, he's an expert in the field of state-society relations, a subject that is very much in line with our topic today. So, Professor Yang.
Well, thank you, John. What I would like to speak to, given the brevity of time, is actually to speak right to the theme of religion and environmental values. I think values are important. There is actually a lot of research on comparative values. China actually scores extremely high in terms of the secular values. In terms of values, for example, on self-expression and so on, it's actually rightly so there. But what's interesting is I have, my team, in fact, have had access to some of the latest surveys related to China, including on issues related to the environment. If we ask people, based on the China General Social Survey, for example, to what extent do you think environmental issues are a top priority? It's surprising that there is not much of a change in how people perceive the environment as an issue for the last 10 years or so, which is very surprising, which is because conventional wisdom suggests that actually there is a lot of issues with the environment. It's when we ask people, do you think air pollution is a problem? Suddenly 70, 80% of the people think it is a big issue. The other, and the same situation is happening, in fact, with water pollution and so on. In all those, actually, what's interesting is we can dissect the data to look at how people actually, so sort of the different kinds of people have different views concerning the environment. We find, for example, in terms of incomes, the highest income people tend to be much more concerned. But again, it also is affected by age. One of the most interesting aspects is religion in this regard. And here I want to summarize. I was planning to show a PPT, but for technical issues, we didn't get it up there, actually. So sort of, we do have a question that allows us to disaggregate the Chinese population into religious and non-religious populations. I have to say with Confucianism is not one of the religions in this case, but nonetheless, I mean, it's a growing percentage of the population who have religious values today. And you ask them, to what extent do you choose the environment as one of the top 3 priorities, in fact. We find that the most interesting aspect is the middle-aged, well, the group that's actually above 30, in fact, the religious groups, or the religious population of the population that's above 30 tends to be to think the environment is more of a serious issue. So environment makes a difference for the older generation. For the people who are below 29 or so, there's no difference at all. Now, the other aspect is when we try to look at combined income and religious values. And here again, actually for the lowest, if you divide the population by income into 4 quartiles, so you have the lowest quartile, then income quartile 2, income quartile 3, and then the highest income quartile. Here is really becomes extremely interesting. The lowest income group and the higher, actually for them, religion has no difference, has no impact on how people perceive the environment as an issue. The highest income group, actually, the most wealthy people among this group, the religious tends to think actually the environment is less of an issue. It's only among the two middle quartiles, the middle class actually in China, who really think that the environment is more of an issue. So we have a situation where there are significant variations, and this is actually among the people who are surveyed, these are more in the Han area, so they do not include the people who are covered in the Tibetan area. So let me emphasize that there is a limit to how those surveys are conducted. But they are national samples. They capture very well what actually sort of people thought about the environment as of 2013 or so. And at the same time, in terms of overall the environment, there is growing awareness, but usually it's when they can relate to it. And that means it's when people think about the air they breathe, the water they drink, suddenly they realize the environment is the issue. But you ask them abstractly about the environment, they tend to be less sensitive to it. I think my time is up. Thank you.
I just want to follow up, Professor, to make sure that I'm following this. You're saying that it's the middle income quartiles, and so basically sort of urban middle class. If they are religious, that group tends to have stronger feelings about the environment, concerns about the environment.
Yes, indeed.
Right.
They are more concerned about the environment by, well, statistically it's significant, I would say.
And can you tell in the disaggregation that you're doing, is concern about the environment a factor driving people to religion, to religious communities, or is affiliation with a religious community heightening one's concerns about the environment?
The data does not allow us to tell it, but my sense is generally is that people who have become religious are more concerned about the environment than the other ways. Usually it's not, although there is always some interaction effect, but it's probably more of a broader issue of, philosophers say that China has a moral vacuum or moral crisis in which people seek answers, and religion is one of the ways that they find the answers. So in that sense, it's really the interest in fact, the religious beliefs that drive people to think much more reflectively on a whole host of issues, including the environment.
So I think you're saying that someone like Jen Zhang, who was, as he describes it, was deeply aware of the environment, environmental issues, and somewhat despair about it, and that sort of led you down a path. That's not typical for what you're seeing.
My sense is, that would not be typical. Of course, Chen Qiang and others, they are very much on the front line in terms of grappling with the environmental crisis. But of course, generally the pattern is there are just increasing numbers of people who are becoming religious in China. In fact, I think there is one survey by Fenggang Yang at Purdue who suggests that fairly soon China may have the largest number of people who are religious believers in the world.
Which we wouldn't have predicted a few years ago. So next we have Ian Johnson, a Beijing-based journalist for the past 15 years who writes for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and other publications, with a specialty on religion and culture. He won a Pulitzer Prize for articles he wrote back in 2000 on the Chinese government's suppression of the quasi-religious group Falun Gong for the Wall Street Journal. So, Ian.
Yeah, well, as a typical journalist, I have a bunch of probably...
It'll work. I bet they're turning it on. Is it coming?
Not yet, but okay. Yeah, as a typical journalist, I have a bunch of unrelated anecdotes that probably are not backed up by an analytical framework. But anyways, I just want to say one thing. I did a project a little while ago for the Open Society Foundation, and one of the reasons that they were interested in supporting this work is because people who are typically interested in the environment in the West, the stereotypical people would be sort of liberal intellectuals who don't go to church or anything like that. People who are often at the forefront of social change in China are more often, in my experience and others, involved in some sort of religious activity. And so there's sort of a disconnect when you're coming from the United States, say, or some Western country, wanting to support social change in China. You often find you're dealing with born-again Christians or born-again Buddhists, and there's sort of like a culture clash. And so they were interested in finding out more about why these people who they normally don't have anything to do with in the West, people who go to regular religious activities, why they would be interested in social change. And you know, I think one of the things with the religious revival in China, and I think it's undoubtedly there is a religious revival, is for many people it will be just a pietistic escape. It's some way to get away. The world is so chaotic and crazy, but in my church, in my temple, in my mosque, the world is intact. And so that's something that certainly motivates some people. But I think Dali makes a really good point that people who are looking for something else will have a critical view of a host of issues. So one of the churches that I've been following for a book I'm writing, the people there have a small charity to support the families of political prisoners. So the political prisoners are often the bread earners, the breadwinners in the family. When they're in jail, their families are in trouble, and so this church is helping out the family members. But in terms of the environment, I do see a link, and again, it's sort of anecdotal, but when Qiying and I, for example, were in Handan, we went and visited this swimming club, and the swimming club, everyone used to swim naked in this river, and they asked me if I'd like to go along, and so I'm like, well, okay, you know, anything for a story. It was this heavily polluted river where they killed off and destroyed the water supply to Handan a couple of years ago, but they assured me that all the stuff had flowed through. It was fine to go swimming. So we went swimming, and then afterwards, the head of the club, they had sued the factory that had discharged all this effluent. And so later went back to his business, which turned out to be a small tea house. And up on the second floor of the tea house, it was a Taoist. He was a lay Taoist, and he had a Taoist shrine, and he was handing out copies of the Tao Te Ching and talking about the importance of nature and being at one with nature, and how Taoism pushes this idea of you know, ziran, nature. And of course the ziran, you can argue from a philological point of view that the two don't really have anything to do with each other, but this is how he interpreted it. The Taoism made him more in touch with nature, and so you could sort of see some activity there. I think also sociologists have started to look at religion. There's a professor at McGill University, Ken Dean, who talks about religions as the second tier of government in some parts of China because they are so powerful in organizing local societies. The people who run the temple in the village are often the elders of the village, and they often hold the party members who run the village accountable for what they do. They're more likely to say, hey, you promised to build a road, why isn't the road being built? Or you promised to clean up the river, why isn't the river being cleaned up? And they have the moral authority to do that because they run the temple. So you can start to see some proof for some of these anecdotes that are coming through. But I think we're sort of still early on in the game, but I think it's certainly a thesis that's defensible, and I think it's one of the more interesting, and as John put in the thing, it's one of the more unexpected effects that you do have some spiritual religious component behind this environmental movement. So with that, I'll stop.
Good. So questions? I have questions, but I'll start with yours. So over here, we can pass a mic.
I found Dali Yang, your survey data, very interesting because it seems to suggest that religion may not be the driving factor behind the environmental movement, but rather meeting a certain threshold of comfort. So in other words, the success in achieving material goals has enabled people to become aware of environmental problems, and maybe the pursuit of a good life is really what is driving the environmental concerns. And religion may give people a way to talk about it, an ethical vocabulary, but it seems to me that given the survey results, we can't posit such a strict dichotomy between materialistic pursuits and religious ethics, because it seems that they're very connected.
Yes.
Well, whenever it comes to China, some of the established equations may not work as well, because typically when we look at values and it's related to secular and self-expressive values, for example, the northern European countries tend to score very high. China scores very high on the secular position, but of course, secular versus traditional, and especially as some political scientists would be saying that that's versus religious to some extent, right? But in the Chinese case, of course, religious in this case actually also means self-expressive, because it's actually a way for those Chinese who are turning to religions as they turn to other values that are not the established values. They are actually finding themselves as well in this process. So it's actually, I think this is a very interesting issue in that regard. And of course, as countries do become more developed, they do tend to become more self-expressive. And the Chinese population is becoming so. In fact, throughout East Asia, including especially the societies in Japan, especially more recently in South Korea and Taiwan, and of course to some extent also Hong Kong, of course as those societies have become more developed, they have indeed become more religious. And because religion in those societies is considered to be modern, to be modernity in many ways. So it's a very interesting phenomenon.
Question over here. Thank you, Andy.
Hi. I grew up in China for 16 years and noticed that there's a lacking model of recycling in everyday life versus Japan that would have 6 trash cans with each a special thing to recycle and throw away. My question is whether recycling could be propagated by religion, and if even mass consumer recycling by the Chinese would even have a measurable effect.
Well, I can address this question. I don't have the data, but it actually right here. But we do have data related to what extent, for example, people sort their garbage based on. We don't find any effect in terms of actual behavior based on religion. But of course, one shining example is Taiwan. Taiwan in recent years has really gone into the recycling, reuse, and reducing their garbage footprint, for example. So there, in fact, the amount of garbage that's being produced is pretty much actually even declining. In the Chinese case, at this point, the big issue is really every city runs into a problem of where to dispose of their garbage. And of course, there are more dumps being built, but more importantly, garbage incinerators. In many cases, however, because they have to build in their own boundaries, the localities increasingly encounter a NIMBY movement.
You know, in Taiwan, it's actually Tzu Chi, one of the largest Buddhist groups that has gone into this recycling, and it's absolutely extraordinary all across the country what they do, as well as relief work in disaster areas and so on. But I think what can be said, maybe your question leads to a larger one, is what motivates people for change or environmental action, whether it's protests or a positive recycling action. And I think the idea here is that these actions, they can certainly come from a secular view and just a sense of we have to have a clean society. But I think the promise here is motivations for the long-term change, right, often come from these cultural traditions. And maybe one of the most interesting things was in May of 2008 when I met with Pan Yue, who was the vice minister for the Ministry for the Environment at that time. He had been working for more than a dozen years precisely on this idea that the cultural traditions of China, Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism, had real potential for this kind of change. And he has, if you look for Pan Yue online, you can see his speeches and so on in English and of course in Chinese.
So just a quick follow on the Taiwan Buddhism case. So if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, was Buddhism organized religion, was it instrumental from the beginning in raising that an issue, or was it raised by others and then they came in later?
Well, it's actually the leader of that particular
But in
sect.
the beginning as well.
Yeah, well, this is a nun of the leader of Suji, and her notion is, sort of a bodhisattva vow of compassion for society is, this is what you do. You do this recycling. They've got the older generation going to these things, sorting out, ranging from major products to garbage and so on. It's one of the most impressive recycling things I have ever seen, and most of it volunteer, motivated by this Buddhist sensibility.
There was a question back in the middle there.
Yeah, one of the quotes from the clip was that if you're a Buddhist, you don't trust the government. You don't put the responsibility of caring for the environment on the government. My Chinese friends that were from Beijing didn't seem to have a sense of individual agency in shaping social issues. Do you think that religion provides kind of this renewed sense of I, as an individual, impact this larger societal problem? Ian, you kind of talked about it with holding the party officials accountable. Do you see that in any other areas?
Yeah, I think you can see it in some areas. Again, it's once if you're involved in a religious community, there's often there's inherently some sort of civil society activity that's taking place. You are organizing, especially if it's an unregistered, say, church, or some of the lay Buddhist and Taoist associations that you see springing up. People are meeting on their own. They're having prayer meetings, not just reading the Bible, but reading the scriptures. And I think that does lead people to say, well, I can organize for other things as well, or I can take matters more into my own hands.
May I add, and actually Yan is a real expert on this issue in terms of looking at civil society in China and especially religious organizations. But of course, within China, there are state-sanctioned religious groups, and also then there are the non-sanctioned. And in many, scholars have studied also the relations. For example, in the villages, the village chiefs tend to interact through their lineages. They are more reluctant to interact through the local church, if there is one. And the relationship in certain provinces between the local authorities and especially the unorthodox churches have been a little strained. So it really depends on the situation. But then sometimes you see an interesting poster basically saying, well, without the Communist Party, there's no Buddha. Which obviously is, but of course there are also those who want to bring their Buddhas closer to the party as well. So you have a great spectrum actually of relationships between the religious organizations and the ruling authorities.
We got a question right here. Let me get a mic.
One of the previous speakers made the important point that while climate change is important to Chinese, pollution is more important. And facing these two problems is sometimes overlaps, but doesn't always overlap. From an international point of view, the climate change issue is more important. So I would wonder if you could break it down a little bit more, how climate change versus ordinary, the normal handling of pollution problems like cleaning up rivers and recycling and stuff like that, where it stands, where the two stand in relation to each other, and where they stand in the framework of the different religions.
This is just a very quick comment that hopefully you'll follow up on. Todd Stern, who's our U.S. climate negotiator in the State Department, and he's been in that position for 5 years, just came to Yale last week and gave a major speech on climate change, in which he said to the relations here, is that he is in very intense dialogue with his partner in the China side of this, and I think some of that's known, and foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation have helped also to make the U.S.-China dialogue very significant on these issues. But I want to also say that Todd Stern said he considers, when he concluded his talk at the law school, that number one conclusion was climate change is a moral issue. And he also said in the reception time, he said, I want the religious leaders in North America. They used to be coming to me more often, but I'd be happy for them to come. So I think this is one of the great promises, hopefully, for Paris of next year, is the US and China negotiations that's happening right now, and with good, I think, good feeling on both sides.
Yeah, I guess the one way to see the climate change issue is that is the existential issue. Of course, what is existential if it's not in some ways a spiritual, it's a religious issue, depending on how you see it. And of course, for many Chinese, increasingly, is actually there is significant overlap between the climate change issue and the pollution issue. In fact, this year, for the first time, I think actually, so sort of in many, many years, coal use in China will decline, I think. And this is actually truly a remarkable development, especially because coal prices have plummeted in China. So you would have expected significant increase to some extent, actually. Instead, in fact, coal use in China appears to be declining this year. And of course, beginning around 2006, the Chinese government has made a major effort to reduce emissions and also especially raise energy efficiency. So energy use per unit of electricity produced actually has significantly improved in terms of, so it's much more efficient today compared to 7, 8 years ago in China. And at the same time, it's not just simply energy use, it's also the improvement in reducing carbon, especially actually emissions. But a lot of those emissions are also related to CO2. So my sense is actually there is overlap. The effort, the organizations that deal with climate change and the organizations that deals with pollution, however, are not exactly the same. One is at the National Development Reform Commission. The other one is at the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Although the current person who deals with climate change originally was head of the Environmental Pollution or Environmental Protection Agency. In that sense, actually, there are organizations that deal with this. For the Chinese, however, I do want to emphasize this point. As China has become the largest CO2 emitter, so it's not simply a collective action where there are many others that produce pollution or emissions, and therefore China is just a small partner. China and the US are the two largest producers. So big countries like this matter, and if they can get together, then they can do much more than two smaller producers, let's say, of carbon dioxide. So in that sense, actually, it's sort of I do think, actually, those are the common challenges. The Chinese tend to emphasize common and differentiated responsibilities. I think they need to step up a little more on the responsibility side.
So we're almost out of time. I wanted to come back. I wanted to follow up on a couple of provocative statements, provocative to me at least, that came out of one of the interviews that was in the clip we showed with Martin Palmer from the United Kingdom. And he made one comment that he thought that the collaboration, the consultation between religion and authority, religion and government in China would likely grow stronger in response to environmental challenges and the materialistic culture. But in the extended interview we did with him, he also made the point that he thought also because of the role that religion is playing, the increasing role, as the panelists were saying, of so many people turning to religion in China, that might contribute to the Communist Party being one of the shorter-lived dynasties in Chinese history. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that before we break.
You want me?
All of them. I'm interested in all three, yes.
First of all, I think actually you look at the Chinese leadership, they are very open in terms of drawing on different sources. And the current President Xi Jinping, who has had a very vigorous leadership in the last 2 years or so, he's been very open about especially drawing on Chinese traditions. But he's also being very careful though, because the traditions he draws on are essentially Daoist, Confucian, and to some extent a little bit Buddhist, but he's not going to other religions in fact, unlike one of his predecessors. The relationship between the authorities and religions in China historically have always been uneasy, going back through the dynasties. In fact, very often, previously, actually, the emperors and so on, they made tremendous effort in making sure that religion doesn't rise to rival the state. So you look back at Chinese history, and for those of you who are especially interested, there is a very interesting book by Frederick Mote, one of the most eminent Chinese historians of China, who actually emphasized how historically, from the very beginning, well, not exactly the very beginning, but certainly from the time that China became unified, the state triumphed over religion, unlike in, let's see, in the West and so on. And that has had significant consequences in terms of the influence. Religion generally has played a more subsidiary role, even though at times, of course, there were more prominent roles played by religious forces. But overall, generally speaking, for the last 2,000 years or so, the civil forces have been dominant in Chinese politics. And I think the current leadership has no willingness to share power in that regard. But at the same time, however, if we look at the changes, political transformations that have happened, especially because used to be people said, well, it's Protestant countries that have become democratic, especially in Northern Europe and so on. The Catholic countries, they are too hierarchical, too traditional. They're not ready for democracy. But of course, then came the 1970s and 80s, and lo and behold, what did you see? It's the countries that were Catholic that suddenly became all democratic, actually, around the world. In East Asia, in particular, in recent years, also, today, for example, we have the largest Muslim democracy in Indonesia, for example. And religious forces have played a significant role across East Asia, including currently in Hong Kong. Ian has been paying a lot of attention to this issue, I think. So my sense is actually it's an uneasy role. The Chinese leadership is actually having sanctioned state churches and state-organized religions, but at the same time is very careful to make sure, in fact, there are periodic campaigns to make sure that unorthodox religions are not given the kind of room that they may want, for example, like in the US and so. But it's a very tense relationship at this very point.
Ian, last thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say Xi Jinping spoke in Paris at the UNESCO headquarters, and he mentioned that Buddhism played a great role in Chinese culture and society after it had indigenized and learned to sort of play by the rules. It had done some good things. I think it's sort of a message to maybe the Christian churches that you guys aren't there yet, so you know you're not going to play such a big role. Yeah, I think they are willing to countenance some things, but like Dali says, the Chinese state over the centuries has always tried to define what's orthodox and what's heterodox, and they will give the traditional and some of the other religions some role. They're going to be very careful about it, though. And I guess Martin Palmer's view is probably that once the genie's out of the bottle, they won't be able to control it. But certainly that's not their intention. They're going to try to control it as much as they can.
Is this on? Yeah, thank you. I agree with my co-panelists. Although I do think if we take Confucianism as its own special case, that Han Confucianism was very much involved with the government and was used for its cosmological correspondences and so on. So Confucianism in particular has its very politicized side and its orthodox side and so on. But I wanted, and also its willingness to keep Buddhist movements at bay, especially if they were revolting and so on. But what I want to just end on is what I think is one of the most remarkable things that has actually taken place, I would almost say, in world history. And that is the, by a very thin thread, that Confucianism, which is probably a tradition that's influenced more people than any other tradition on the planet, just given the sheer numbers of China and its long continuity. But to have a tradition that was so consciously destroyed during the Cultural Revolution and earlier, and even way earlier in the 20th century, the May 4th movement and so on, a tradition that was felt to be feudalistic, antiquated, ideological, conservative, and so on. What happened, and I don't think we have the full story by any means, but to me it is an amazing story of why culture matters and what people can do, a very few people can do to keep it alive. And that is when Mao took over and when some Chinese intellectuals went to Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore, but particularly in Hong Kong and Taiwan, they kept that tradition alive in the universities there. And not only that, but they kept it alive in dialogue with Western philosophy and so on. And one of the motivations in others, my teacher at Columbia, Ted DeBerry, and even Du Wei-Ming, and so on, is to say, as there is this resurgence of Confucianism on the mainland, what is it in this tradition that could have been kept alive by these scholars at great odds and transferred back in dialogue to mainland scholars and others? And that is a story that I think will be a story for all cultures. How do cultures endure, and how do they contribute something to our modern world? And I think all of these traditions can do this, but they need our help and they need our encouragement. Thank you so much for this panel.
So on that note, we are out of time, and I hope you see why this subject has been so fascinating to us at the Pulitzer Center. I hope you'll follow our work as we continue. We have a lot more projects on this we want to do. And I want all of us to thank you for the great questions and for all of you coming out. And of course, thank all 6 of the panelists for the great expertise they brought. Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.